On Wednesday, April 28th, Michael Collins, Gemini 10 and Apollo 11 astronaut, died at the age of 90.
One of our true heroes. We decided that we wanted to do a whole extra episode away from our weekly schedule in order to fully celebrate his life and legacy.
To help us do this, we're joined by author and historian Francis French.
Of course, we'd love to hear your own Michael Collins memories and stories, so do get in touch. But for now, here is our Space and Things attempt to honor Michael Collins.
This operation is somewhat like the periscope of a submarine. All you see is the three of us, but beneath the surface are thousands and thousands of others. To all those, I would like to say thank you very much.
I'm Emily Carney.
And I'm Dave Giles. It's been a strange few days, hasn't it, Emily? It's such a weird thing when one of your childhood heroes passes away. I didn't know him personally, but I've been walking around as if one of my friends has died. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. It was weird. Like, me and my husband were talking about it, because my husband obviously knows who Michael Collins is. Me saying this, I'm not passing judgment on Neil Armstrong's life and career, but I was like, Neil Armstrong was somebody who was revered in this community, right? I feel like Michael Collins was like worshipped almost by people. And let me explain what I mean by that. I don't know what it is. I think maybe it was because he was he was humble. Like, we've heard that a lot in the last few days, but he truly was. Like, if you talk to him, I talked to him a couple times. He was just really like, oh yeah, wasn't, he would always try to sort of be very self-deprecating. No ego. I mean, just no ego at all. And it's just been crazy. Like, I would never mention any names, but in the last few days since he died, I've had a few friends of mine text me or message me. Some of them have just been like, I can't stop crying over this. And I'm like, these are men, and I was just like, I think it was just because he was kind of the moon man who was one of us, I guess.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, and I know I felt the same. I messaged you saying I had puffy eyes and a headache because of it. I kind of also feel that Neil Armstrong died before he got the opportunity to be revered by our communities as much. I feel there's an element of that as well, and that's not to say that what Mike's getting now isn't deserved. It is deserved, but because of the way the internet has developed since 2012, we now have. I didn't see when Neil Armstrong died, I didn't see any outpouring from people I knew or people or in a community anywhere. And I felt isolated in my grief for the fact that Neil had died. And now I have a community of people I can turn to and not have to bug my friends and family about it and just be like, oh my God, this has happened. And I can see things and hear personal accounts of him and hear stories that I would never have seen otherwise because of the nature of various groups, which, you're a huge part of setting up one of the key ones. And we didn't have that. Maybe we did have that in 2012 when Neil died, but I didn't know of it. So
it wasn't as big back then. It was we probably had like 100 people in the group by that point. So it definitely was not as well known.
Yeah.
And there was an outpouring, but it was a different circumstance because Neil died. I feel like it was almost like Neil sort of died before he got his due, almost like, there was an autobiography about him, and there's a great autobiography about him that was out, First Man, by Jim Hansen, and not to take away from Armstrong's accomplishments or life at all, but I feel like it was like he died almost before people sort of recognized, okay, this is how, important this man was. I feel like, especially in the space community, I feel like he died before there could almost be sort of this outpouring of, okay, we lost somebody big, whereas Mike Collins, it's a little different.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's interesting to note that I think all Apollo astronauts seem to have found more fame in the last 10 years, even Buzz.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe it would be off the charts with Neil now, but also with Mike writing his books, which connected to so many and attending events to reach out to people, which Neil didn't do. Maybe he would have done, but he didn't do them then. It's kind of easy to see why within the community this is such a big event. Plus, there are now only 10 people left who have been to the moon. And we therefore have to start thinking that the end of this era really is soon. And I know we don't like to think like that, but it is.
Yeah, I mean, it was already a small fraternity to start with. I mean, when, 50 years ago, that was a small fraternity, and now it's gotten just even smaller. I mean, there's not many. Oh boy, I'm getting emotional. There's just not many left.
Yeah.
And I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it.
Either do I, but I do think it factors into how each of these deaths impact us. But I also feel that there is a shock element to this. There was a false sense of security in him being around, partly because he had a social media presence, and I know that they were run by his family, those accounts, but it still made him seem so alive. There was a post just a day or so before the announcement of his death, and as far as I'm aware, it wasn't public knowledge that he was even ill.
Yeah, I didn't know.
So even though he was old, I just wasn't expecting this to happen now.
Yeah, it felt like that, honestly, with Al Warden as well, because...
Yeah, I agree.
Because people are like, oh, he was 88, and the same thing with Mike, he was 90, he lived a long life. Yeah, they both lived great long lives, but they weren't done. Like, you have this feeling like they really weren't done yet. Like, they were still sharp. Yeah, they were older, but you still felt when you talked to them, or if you were in the same room with them, they still had a lot of life to live. They weren't just, these elderly men or something like that. They still had energy, they were still vital. You couldn't tell them they weren't in the prime of their life.
Yeah.
So it just, you get a feeling that, they are in their late 80s and some are in their early 90s, but you just feel like they weren't done yet. So I totally understand. It was almost like, what? He can't die. He's Mike Collins.
He's not allowed to. Yeah, he's going to be hit forever.
He's Mike Collins. He can't go, So yeah, when I was getting messages, from male, friends of mine who were like, I just can't stop crying today. I was like, wow. It was more than one person who was like, I feel like a whole era just died. It was just shock. Like this, you just felt like he wasn't done yet.
Yeah. And I think what's beautiful about the current era is we have got this wonderful opportunity to see and hear so much outpouring of celebration of his life, and that's what we're attempting to do here. There's been some wonderful posts across the internet from so many people who either knew him or met him or had some kind of personal story or relationship with him that we wouldn't have seen many years ago, and Buzz's tweets and social media posts have been, I know they weren't close friends, but he's someone that's heavily associated with him, and it's just wonderful to see all these little stories and these little nuggets come out. So for me, I've been pouring through them over the last few days, and really enjoying that as well.
Yeah, that to see some of the stories and stuff, it's been a great comfort through this time. You feel like oh God, now I'm really going to start crying. I think a friend of mine sent me this clip a few weeks ago when Phil Chapman died, and I think it's very appropriate now. It's the Star Trek Wrath of Khan. He's not really dead as long as we remember him.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, I'll stop.
Do you know there's the ancient Egyptians believe you die twice. This is deep. The ancient Egyptians believe you die twice. Once when your physical body passes, but secondly when the last person speaks your name. And in that sense, I don't believe Mike's ever going to die, because I think he's always going to be talked about.
I agree. Yeah, he's always, as long as he's written and spoken about, which will be for a very long time, he's always going to be here. So.
He's always going to be here. Exactly. So I think we should now get on to introducing our guest today, as we do more to celebrate the life of Mike Collins. So Emily, please introduce him.
Francis French is a space historian who has written a number of books with astronauts and about the Apollo era. Many of you probably know him from book titles In the Shadow of the Moon and Falling to Earth, among many others. He also used to be a director of the San Diego Air and Space Museum, amongst many other jobs, which make him one of the leading voices about space exploration history. We hope that he will join us again in the future to talk about a number of topics which we know he's an expert in, But today we present to you our celebration of the life of Michael Collins.
Radio world, hold on to your hat. I'm going to turn you upside down.
So welcome, Francis French. Thanks for joining us on Space and Things to celebrate the life of Mike Collins. Now, I don't know where to start with this, to be honest. When you think of Mike Collins, what's the first thing that's come to your head?
Well, thanks for asking me to come today. I love the fact you say celebrate, because it's the second I think of Mike Collins, I have a smile on my face, even though this is a really sad week and we've lost him. He is the kind of guy who brings a grin because he was so nice, and there's nothing bad to say about this guy. You know, as Emily and I have gossiped about over the years at various space events, there's normally something you can say about somebody that's not 100% positive. Mike Collins, thank goodness, lovely, lovely guy. I mean, everything. He was a credible test pilot. Everybody who flew with him in aviation or in space talks about what an amazing guy he was. Hard worker, incredible pilot. But he was a well-rounded guy. I mean, he loved food. He loved good wine. When he was going through the astronaut program and he was asked to grade various types of space food, he did it like a gastronomical French guide. I mean, he had fun with this stuff, you know. And you'd think, you know, being on Apollo 11, the ultimate space mission, probably then and still now, the first moon landing, you might have a bit of a big ego. And each of the three people on that mission all went in very different directions, mentally and career-wise after that. And he's just the guy who was self-deprecating, wry, funny. You couldn't compliment him. It was really annoying. You tell him what a great book he'd read or something, he's like, you know, just wouldn't take a compliment. But that's how he was. He was just a lovely, lovely guy. So a life well lived, and how to deal with fame.
Mm. Yeah, and my understanding, I've heard him say a few times that he really he didn't even like the concept of fame, let alone the fact that he had it. And I think that says a lot about him as well. So Emily or Francis, feel free to jump in and give a kind of highlight of his career, which you think that are things that, obviously, Apollo 11 we'll get onto, but what are the other things that are about Mike's career that you think are things that people need to know that they don't know?
Oh, wow. Well, I probably stole from Francis here, but people really need to know that he wrote what probably is the gold standard of astronaut autobiographies. That to me is, I mean, probably one of the first things casual observers need to know. Carrying the Fire. Everyone needs to read that. That is just the best astronaut autobiography, and there's a lot of good ones. So not to down other ones, Falling to Earth, but Carrying the Fire, I think, really set the template for the astronaut autobiography. Like, I think it's one that other astronauts probably look at and say, okay, this is what I have to go up against, or this is what, you know, I'm inspired by. He kind of introduced a lot of tropes, I think. And when I say that, I don't give that a negative connotation, but in Carrying the Fire, he introduced a lot of things that sort of endure in like other astronaut autobiographies. Like I don't think he introduced this, but he sort of perfected the talking about his fellow colleagues without being too insulting. Like, there's this great part in Carrying the Fire where he sort of talks about each of his colleagues and, you know, sort of, you know, describes what kind of personalities they are. And that, to me, when I first read that book years ago, was just fascinating, because it's like, okay, I feel like we're getting to kind of know some of these people, you know? And you also get to know Mike, and you know, obviously, which is wonderful. I mean, he's so not full of himself. He's very funny. He's very self-deprecating. He rates himself as being lazy in Carrying the Fire, which I think is hysterical, because I'm like, dude, you were on Apollo 11. How are you lazy? Like, what? I mean, it's just such an amazing book. I really can't do it justice just by me talking about it, really. It's just you have to read it. If you haven't read it yet, you got to read it.
I agree with that. And Francis, as someone who's written books with astronauts, as Emily alluded to there, do you feel that there is a pressure when you're writing books with other astronauts these days to compete with Carrying the Fire, or does that not come into it? But as Emily said, this kind of set the standard, and it was done in 1974 or published in 1974, so it was so close back then to all the action. Is it something that comes up in conversations when you're talking to astronauts about their books, or is it in the back of your head at all when you're writing these books and finishing the product?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure competition is exactly the right word, but everything you said in terms of it being a healthy impetus is absolutely true, because there's a certain point, it'd be like being a heavyweight boxer now and trying to be Muhammad Ali. It's like, forget it. He's going to be the greatest ever. So you can just try and do what you can to learn from lessons of other people. The great thing, there were challenges that Carrying the Fire gave me and Al Worden from Apollo 15 when we wrote his book, Falling to Earth, that Emily mentioned. One was that I really noticed the closer to the program, the better the books, the more visceral, original, fresh stuff. And as you started getting into the 80s and the 90s, they started becoming a little bit more like speeches I'd heard the astronauts give. They're still full of great information, but they don't feel quite so in the moment. So one of the things I really tried to take from Carrying the Fire was, he wrote that right after it happened. He wasn't done with Apollo 11 until 1970. He wasn't done with NASA for a while afterwards. For it to come out in 74, he must have hit the ground running, writing it right away. So how do we get back to that fresh feeling? So that was where I was going back into original transcripts, original interviews, and with Al just picking very fresh stuff. What was it like in that room? How did it feel? What did it smell like? What did you hear? Trying to get those firsthand impressions to get back to that book that he could have written, back in 1970 something that he didn't. So that was a close one. I don't think there's going to be a book as good as that. There've been some shuttle ones like Mike Mullane's that have come close to being in that sort of top pantheon. But anytime that somebody said, this is Falling to Earth is in my top 3, with Carrying the Fire being, of course, the number 1, it's just a given. That felt good. Anytime it got compared to it, close, I was like, okay, that's good. Because you could never compete with it, but you could hope to approach it. That was the best we could do.
And what do you think, Francis, are some of the things that aren't remembered as well about his career, particularly his astronaut career? We'll get on to what he did after NASA in a little while, but obviously Apollo 11 everyone knows, but are there other things you think he achieved as an astronaut or as a pilot which you think aren't celebrated enough, and things that we should be talking about this week in particular?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Apollo 11, there's a lot that we can get onto the Roll of the Command Module pilot. It's always there's been so many obits this week about the forgotten astronaut, which is a horrible thing to read, but it's also kind of true. He's the one, he's the George Harrison of the Apollo 11. He's the one name that everybody goes, there's John and Paul, and then of course Ringo, and then who's that other guy? It's always the other guy that's left out. But yes, absolutely. These Gemini stuff is insane. The stuff they were doing on those Gemini missions that he was in the middle of. I mean, he and John Young, they get on a Gemini spacecraft. They launch an Agena uncrewed rocket before that, gets into orbit. They dock with it, and then nose to nose, they fire that uncrewed rocket to send them into a higher orbit. So if you could imagine, they're both sitting in what is essentially like a 2-person fighter jet seat, like the Gemini is, looking out of little windows, looking at another rocket, which then fires and pushes them back into their straps. So they're hanging at 1G, the same weight as we are on Earth, in their straps, looking down on a rocket that's pushing them back first up into space. Nobody flies in space like that, back first, looking at the rocket with all the flame coming out of it. I think they fired that thing 3 times to get into the final orbit they get up into, where they then rendezvous with another Agena, the one that Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins' eventual commander, had so much trouble with, the one that had almost killed him. They find this dead spacecraft, and then he tries to EVA over to it, tries to do a spacewalk over to it, and they don't know how to do spacewalks. I mean, they know enough that they think it's going to be like a movie. You just sort of float out there with a little gas gun in your hand. And so he gets his foot snagged on the door and goes sort of like tumbles over and almost hits something. He jumps out another time and gets pushed around to the back of the spacecraft and hits it. They have this big umbilical cord for the oxygen and for the and the radio communications and things. And it's like taking a garden hose that's been sitting out in the sun for summer after summer that won't unkink properly, and you think you can just sort of fly smoothly over to another spacecraft and grab hold of it. Of course, this hose is going to whip you around and pull you in different directions, and nothing like what they thought. He gets over there, he can hardly get this. There's no handholds. He's got to try and get his gloved hand onto a bit of spacecraft. Newton's law is eternal. He starts holding onto something, the whole spacecraft starts shimming around and trying to buck him off. They didn't know what they were doing, and somehow in the middle of all this, Mike Collins managed to get over there, pull off a piece of an experiment they put on the side to see what happened if something was left in space a long time. Manages to not cut his glove on a huge bundle of wires and other sharp metal objects that could have cut through his spacesuit, and still manages to get back to the spacecraft, bring it back in. I mean, if he'd never gone on Apollo 11, that kind of stuff is just, Wild West insanity of the sort of the original frontier of spaceflight, where they're just doing stuff that nobody would even think about doing. And some of that stuff has never been done again, and probably for good reason, but they were learning as they went, and Mike was a fortunate survivor of that era.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I've seen his Gemini 10 suit as well. There's nothing of it. It was such they don't look worthy of an EVA compared to the big bulky suits that then went on the moon and what they use in the shuttle era. Those Gemini suits just there's nothing of them. It's like a pressure suit, and that's it. And to think that he put himself at that risk, and he was the first person to do 2 spacewalks on one mission. Am I right in that? I think I'm right in that.
Yeah, they did some things where they basically opened the hatch and threw junk out and stood in the seat and things like that. So they did. It really depends on how you count it. Yeah, but
right, okay.
It was, but just having a rocket and going finding another rocket in space and all that stuff. All 3 of the Apollo 11 astronauts all did amazing stuff on Gemini, with Rendezvous, and then EVA with Mike Collins, and then of course Buzz Aldrin is the one who, on the very last seat on the very last Gemini mission, is the one who goes, we need to stop, and instead of trying to do things, just learn how to do this. We need handholds, we need foot restraints, we need tethers. And he practiced in swimming pools like a ballet dancer, like the movement of, okay, if I go here, I'm going to not make myself flip over this way. And Buzz was the guy on the very last mission who actually worked it out. So all those Gemini guys before that, like Mike, were just hoping for the best and trying things and getting back and going, well, that didn't work. What do we do next time?
Yeah, learning from your mistakes when the stakes are that high, why not? Anyway, moving on to the Apollo program. So obviously Mike has spoken in depth and in many interviews about the fact that he was happy with his seat on Apollo 11. But I've not heard him talk as much. I know he talks about in his book, obviously, about the fact he was originally on the Apollo 8 crew, but I needed to have an operation on his neck, so didn't end up on that flight, ended up on Apollo 11 instead. Do you know if he would have preferred to have been on Apollo 8 rather than the seat he had on Apollo 11?
I don't know whether he ever actually said much about which one he personally preferred. I know he spoke a lot about why they were both really important missions. I think he talked about Apollo 8 as leaving Earth and Apollo 11 as arriving somewhere else, if I recall. They're both vital missions, and they're both a huge part of what humanity has done. When it comes to whether he wanted to land, I think he did say he was under no illusions. He didn't have the best seat on the mission. But a lot of people forget, if you're a pilot, the lunar module pilot job, you're not piloting anything. You're a systems engineer. You're checking and helping the commander to land. Once you get on the moon and you get to do geology and other things, you're pretty much an equal. But if you're a pilot and you care a lot about flying, that's not a great seat. It depends what you care about. If you're a command module pilot, you are the person who does almost all the flying on the mission. You get them to the moon, you get them back. You are in charge of a solo spacecraft that is the only way home. And if the lunar module has a problem and it can lift off, but only barely, and get into some kind of weird low orbit, you have to know how to zip down there and find them and save all 3 people. Or you go home alone, which is another whole job that, a 3-person job that you're doing on your own. This is a really difficult piloting job. So if you care about piloting, that's a pretty big task. So a lot of people forget that was actually the number 2 position, not the lunar module pilot was a relatively lowly thing. And if you're a test pilot like Mike Collins, that's a big deal to be. You have to save Neil and Buzz and get them back from the moon if needed. That's no small job. There's nothing to be ashamed of in that job.
Yeah, and he had a little book which he'd written of 18 different rendezvous scenarios which he may have had to have attempted depending on how Neil and Buzz got off the moon. Of course, there was a chance they may not go off at all. I wonder what training they did for that scenario and how he felt about that, I know he said that he only actually thought there was a 50-50 chance of them completing this mission.
I think that the thing is that there's no training to come back solo from the moon, because you're doing the same procedures as if all three of you there, because you're the one flying. So that's the thing that people forget. He's actually the one flying that stuff. So in that way, in terms of training, it's simple. In terms of emotionally, in terms of how you think about it, we forget that most of these people were combat pilots as well. They've been in situations where people were actively trying to kill them. The great thing about the Apollo program is everybody was actively trying to save their lives, including, as we saw with Apollo 13, the whole world, the Cold War enemies. Everybody was like, what can we do? Kind of nice, when you've had people shooting at you in Korea and Vietnam, and sometimes even in World War II, some of those astronauts were old enough that this is a kind of a nice place to be. But it's true that you definitely have to think about that stuff. If they were stuck on the surface, there's nothing a command module pilot could do. I mean, they're stuck on the surface. They can't take off. You have to leave them behind. Probably stay as long as you can until you are down to your last little bit of oxygen, because the people on the ground, people landed on the moon, are not going to just give up. If it's a case of like, one of us can get off, if the other person stands outside and hotwires the thing, that's better than both of us dying. They would do stuff like that. They were test pilots. They were military folks. They knew the risks. But if there was any kind of orbit that those guys could get off the moon and into, that was what they would have tried to have done. They would have tried to try and launch. I'll try and get to you. Let's give it a go, even if that means risking the command module as well. That seemed to have been the quid pro quo in all this. That I can't speak for every individual crew, but that seems to have been the general Apollo thing to do. If you can get off the surface in any way, we'll try and get you. If you're stuck there, you got to go home.
I think it was, I don't know, it wasn't Mike Collins, but I think Al Worden, if I'm incorrect, Francis, please correct me. I think Al Worden basically said he had to come to terms with, okay, what if I'm the only one coming back? Because you just didn't, it sounds so fatalistic and awful, but it's like, that's a possibility, it's something you have to kind of mentally wrap your head about. So I know he discussed it. I don't know if Collins ever did. I know Collins said he developed an eye twitch.
Most of the time it was the folks on the ground and the mission controllers were the ones obsessing and worrying about this, particularly in like the early human missions, like, with Yuri Gagarin, they're like, is he sleeping okay the night before? And is he this? And is he that? And most of these folks like, just leave me alone. I know what I'm doing. I know the risk. Just let me go. You stop worrying. You're worrying me by worrying about it, so.
I think they had it. They had it. They knew what was up.
Yeah, we're probably doing the same thing here. We're probably, obsessing with worry about stuff, which these guys are like, if I die, I gave it my best. The thing that really seems to have mattered is, if I die, I don't want it to be my fault. If the mission goes wrong and we don't make it, that's one thing. If it's like Apollo 11 fails because Mike Collins pressed the wrong switch and that's the headline, then it's like, I'd rather die. I'd rather not come home. That seems to have been the thing, is not making a mistake is way more important than life or death.
Yeah, I'm get your head around that. And another thing for me to get my head around. So when I think of Mike Collins, I think of honesty, and I'm sure reading Carrying the Fire has something to do with that. But also this last week, there's been so many stories about his character. There was a guy talking on the BBC this week who I think was part of the 13 Minutes to the Moon podcast, and they interviewed Mike as part of that. And apparently when he turned up, his daughters turned around, Mike Collins' daughters turned around to him and said, look, if you ask a stupid question, he will tell you it's stupid. But if you ask a good question, he'll go on for hours. So there's this honesty with him. Now, my one experience of Mike Collins in the flesh was at this event at GW University in Washington, D.C. as part of the 50th anniversary. And the thing that really took me by surprise was he was talking about the Apollo 11 mission, and he seemed genuinely surprised. Looking back at it, I don't know if this is a hindsight thing, but the thing he said was, we actually did it. And he said it almost with surprise in his voice. I know I said earlier that he only gave them 50% chance of it being successful, but even now he looks back with that, we did this kind of surprise. And knowing how honest I know that he is and how honest people have said he is, hearing that from him is almost surprising.
You look at the Apollo 11, the movie, the IMAX movie, and it kind of has the steps of, the whole mission broken down kind of simplistically. I don't think until I watched that entire movie, because there's a lot of NASA Apollo films and they're not of the era, and they're not bad. I don't want to diss them, but they're kind of, of their time. They got some cheesy music in them, they're kind of, yeah, they kind of other, they got some Star Trek like music, and they're okay, and you don't really, and it's some dry narrator talking over it, like, and stuff like that. They're not bad, but when I watched the movie Apollo 11 in IMAX, I finally got this sense of, with all the reading I've done about Apollo, with everything I've looked at about Apollo probably in my life, I got this sense of there were so many steps that just had to go off like that, like without a hitch. Not just the crew members, but each person who had a job during Apollo. And I'm not just talking about mission control. I'm talking about people who built the vehicle, and people who had support roles that we don't, people who aren't famous, it's just everything just had to contribute to that for it to go off a certain way. It's really just, I'll shut up. It's more like my mind is sort of blown that this went off perfectly, because you'd like to see that kind of thing happen nowadays, but I feel like things are a little different. I don't know. It just blows my mind that all went off, perfectly. And I think it went off perfectly throughout the entire program, which says a lot. So it's just, yeah. And obviously Mike Collins was a little, he would argue he was a little piece of that.
You're absolutely right, Emily. I mean, that you think about when the Apollo 1 fire was, January 67, they didn't get flying again until October of 68. The next summer, they're on the moon. They've not just been to the moon. They've done Apollo 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, and they've landed on the moon. What?
Yeah.
Nothing went wrong. None of those got delayed. Nothing happened. I mean, it's just, I have to say, these days, if you had a fire like that in January of 67, they'd still be writing a report in summer of 69. They wouldn't be on the moon. It is absolutely incredible what they did. And then there's the other side of what, like Dave was saying about how impossible, magical this seems, which is, it was this weird bit of the mid 21st century that kind of got thrown into the 1960s, 20th century. And for 4 years, we went to the moon, then we've never been back. It is magical, impossible. And I do understand the people who are skeptics initially, when they get into the nut job theories, forget it. But when the first people go like, we can't have done that, because you look at it and you're like, I looked at the moon last night and I'm like, we went there. How did we do that? It does seem impossible. So I can totally understand why somebody who even did it would be surprised he did it. Yeah.
All right, you are go for TLI. Over. Roger, understand. We're go for TLI.
I now think we should move on to his post-NASA career and just briefly look at that. So he went to work for the State Department and then ended up running the Smithsonian, or setting up the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. And I think that's a really crucial job that I think is a part of his life, which he's so proud of as well. And as I mentioned earlier, I was at this event at GW University, which kind of was a combination of these two, because it was a Smithsonian event that was at the State Department, and he was talking about space diplomacy, which kind of sums up this whole thing. And it also ties in with Apollo 11, because they went on this big world tour and they were diplomats on that tour. And he said some really lovely things. He told some great, obviously, in his classic way, he told some very funny stories. Great story about Prince Philip and his frayed shirt, and which I very much enjoyed. But he really, and I wrote this down. So this is a little diary I wrote at that for my trip for the Apollo 50th anniversary, and I can barely read my own writing because I was trying to write so much in such a short space of time. But I wrote this: he's truly inspiring, and everyone needs to hear him talk. He talked about the fragile Earth, and about how he had the world in his window, and can some of the manifestations of the fragility be overcome? Yes, if we put our minds to it. And this is one, and Emily, it's weird that we kind of talked about this last week in last week's podcast. He said this, that the US should be a friendly power in the world, not overbearing, and that a unified approach to space goals should be used. It might be slower, but it's more important. And it seems to me that he really did straight away. He had those opinions then, and they've just carried on through his life. That he had these bigger ideas and ideals of what space can and should be, and was an advocate for that, and used his voice within setting up the Smithsonian and his role within the State Department to try and vocalize those ideas, and he kept doing it throughout his life. I found that kind of stuff super inspiring. But if either of you have any insight to either of those jobs, please jump in right now.
What I love about what he did with as far as the Smithsonian, the State Department, and all that, all those roles that he did, I don't want to diss anybody that he may have flown with, but Francis is laughing here. I think in those roles, especially with heading up the Smithsonian and really, really him being sort of a public face during that time, because he was still, Mike Collins, the Apollo 11 astronaut. He wasn't as famous as Buzz and Neil, but he had a certain level. He had a certain level of fame. We'll just put it that way. Him being sort of the face of that really ushered in, and there's probably more variables, really ushered in like the era of the Great Space Museum, where, people were excited. This was like a destination, like, hey, let's go to the Smithsonian, let's go to Air and Space Museum. I remember, of course, I'm a space nerd, but, me and my husband, when we were dating, we used to go to Washington, D.C. every so often because we lived in Virginia. So we just drive over to D.C. And the first place Steve would want to go would be like, hey, I want to go see the Air and Space Museum. And I'm like, you're not really into...
Marry that man. Marry him now.
Exactly. I know. I was like, okay, I think I found him. But and Steve's really, he likes space flight, but he's not like obsessed. Like he has a lot of background knowledge, but he's not like a friggin' nutcase like I am as far as space is concerned. So when he said that, I was like, what? I want to go see, Columbia. I want to see the command module. And I was like, what? Okay. We'll go see it. But that was a place that, sort of a more casual fan was like, I got to go and see that, because it's, and I was like, and I feel like Mike Collins is a huge, variable in why people want to go see it. He was sort of a public face. He, I'm sure there were things that he wanted for the museum that are there. I don't think he gets his dues for really ushering in the whole era of like the destination Air and Space Museum, whereas, people want to, a place that people like, hey, I got to go see that if I'm in DC. Some of his colleagues have done different things, have done like sort of rap songs and I don't even know how to put this, have done some other things, and I'm trying not to be critical of it, but I feel like Collins's legacy, while he was very who he was sort of quiet, very dignified, very elegant, didn't really court the spotlight, had a lot of criticisms about celebrity, which I think is awesome. Collins really made a huge impact in his own way. I don't think people know it as much, but he still did it. I mean, for my boyfriend, at the time to be like, hey, we got to go see the Air and Space Museum. I was like, what? That to me speaks to Collins's legacy, that somebody who's really not into space would want to go, yeah, I want to go see Apollo 11. I want to go see that stuff. That's really important. And I'm like, okay, that really speaks to his legacy in ways that, I think, I just think it needs to be noted. It's really awesome.
That's very true, Emily. I mean, that museum, I'm a museum person, and it's the only place in the world I can think of where in one view you could see a human-flown Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo spacecraft in one view. Not the only place that has those. Kennedy Space Center has them, but they're in different rooms. Houston has had them on and off, depending on whether the Mercury spacecraft was on loan or not. In California, you can see the three of them in a row, but one of them was flown by a chimp, which is not quite the same thing. But you go to there and you could see not only those three in one view, but you could see the first, powered Wright brothers plane for a while there. You could see the first plane that broke the sound barrier. You could see the first solo crossing of the Atlantic, all in one view. And it's only now, decades after Mike Collins, was instrumental in setting up that museum, that they're changing that, because having them hanging from the ceiling, having them in bright sunshine with a bright light roof wasn't necessarily the best thing for them for what we know now. But in terms of impact, when you walked in, what drama. And then to see that little charred husk of a Columbia left, and to think from that, that original Saturn V rocket, as tall as the Statue of Liberty with its pedestal, this little bit is left. And even then you can never use it again. Just gave you a sense of the whole impact and scale of the mission without having to have any interpreters, any signage, any context, you could just look at all that and go, wow. So yeah, what an incredible thing he did. But why was he there? Why was he doing that? With the Apollo guys, there was a tiny little window where you could get a great job or nothing. And it's so much to do with Apollo, how Apollo was perceived by the public. When the Apollo 8 folks came back, and then the Apollo 11 folks came back, Richard Nixon, he realized the allure of having astronauts around him. Frank Borman got a great job. Bill Anders became the most successful post-Apollo astronaut ever. And the same with Mike Collins, the same with Neil Armstrong, who stayed at NASA for a little bit until he decided he wanted to go off and do something else. The world was theirs. You had the president of the United States saying, what government job do you want? Just name it. I'll give it to you. By the time you came back from like Apollo 13 or 14, you're like, oh yeah, you guys. Yeah. I don't know. The whole allure had gone. So if you were quick, like Frank Borman was, you could jump onto something really quick. And Mike was absolutely right. As you say, he was a diplomat type. He was classy, and he could do something like put through a major project like that, which I mentioned it's taken half a century for them to even think about a redesign. It's been that is very rare in any kind of museum where you're like, let's keep that for a long time. Now they've changed it, but it endured, that's for sure.
I said this a few times. When I walked in there, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I was in there mid-refurb, so they'd removed some of the artifacts. Columbia wasn't in there, that had been moved out, and it was on tour, and some other artifacts weren't in there. But in my mind, I was like, how do you insure this place? This has got the most priceless artifacts in one room. Why would you put them all in one room? That's ridiculous. But it's so, at the same time, as you say, that level of awe-inspiring, wow, we're in the Capitol. All of this is here in one room, and you can't help but just be like, this is incredible. The X-15 just hanging there casually with some dust on it. As you said, not just a Gemini and a Mercury capsule, but you've got the first orbit and the first American spacewalk, along with a real lunar module, of which there are only 2 or 3 left. It's crazy what was in that one room, as well as not forgetting the other aeroplanes that are in there that are also incredible artifacts in themselves. And there's that one photo of him before it opened, which is possibly my favorite photo of Mike Collins, just sitting there doing his paperwork at the bottom of the escalator. And if there's not a more iconic photo of him, I don't know. I think I love all the photos of him in space, but that one photo I just think sums him up. Just quietly going about his business in the middle of that room. It's just wonderful.
It is a great picture. I love that picture. I hate that escalator because that's where I get stuck. So my first book comes out. I'm at the Smithsonian. They're asking me to do a book signing. The store is right opposite there. And you sit at this table and you can see the Columbia spacecraft from there and you feel great. And the first person comes to the table and they're like, where are the restrooms? And that's what I do for the rest of the day. You know, I did sign some books, had a lot of people come by, but most of my time was they're over there on the left. You know, so yeah, never get a book signing in that particular spot because that's what you end up doing.
Mike probably did this on purpose. Like he probably had the layout like that on purpose so he could troll like other authors. Because maybe at some point he figured out that was, okay, that happened to me, so now everybody's going to have to go through this. Like, that seems like a Mike thing. So, yeah, that's funny.
Absolutely. So, do either of you have personal Mike stories, which I think you would like to share? I've done my only one. I was sitting in the audience of him, and I thoroughly enjoyed hearing him talk. But I know that both of you have met him and spent time with him, maybe. So if you have personal stories or anything you think you'd like to share right now, please do.
Mine's actually really short. I regret to say I didn't talk to him a lot. I saw him a lot during Space Fest, but I didn't talk to him a lot, mainly because he was with his family, and I was kind of like, I felt weird about bugging him when his daughters were there, you know, because he was very close to he had you could just tell he had a wonderful relationship with his kids. They just seemed to be such a warm and, you know, very close family, which was really cool to see. I really loved that. But the first Space Fest I went to was in 2016, and I was talking to a friend of mine. I was like, God, that's Mike Collins, man. I want to talk to him, but I'm terrified. And my friend's like, why? He's really nice. And I was like, well, it's Mike Collins, you know, blah, blah, blah. So my friend was like, let's just go over and talk to him, man. And he was actually, there was nobody at his table at the time, which was rare. So they were like, just go over there and talk to him. He's not going to hurt you. So I was like, okay, I'll go over and talk to him. So I go over, and I said, General Collins, and then he was like, just call me Mike. And I was like, okay. So Mike, I don't want to bother you, but I just wanted to say, Carrying the Fire, I think, is the greatest astronaut autobiography ever. I've read it probably hundreds of times, and, thanks for doing that. And he just gave me this big warm smile and said, why do you read such smut? And I was like, oh my God. And then I was like, can I get a picture? He's like, yeah, of course. So he puts his arm around me and we get a picture, and he had a smile in the picture. So I'd like to believe he actually liked me, because sometimes he's not one of those people you see smile in pictures a lot. He's kind of stoic. But yeah, that's really my only memory of him. And I've talked to a few other people who had like the same, like they'd be like, man, I love Carrying the Fire. And he's like, oh, whatever, that's just something little I wrote, over a few weekends on some yellow legal paper. And I'm like, what? Like he made it sound like he just, had a notebook. He was like, yeah, whatever, not a big deal. And it's like the greatest book anybody's probably ever done, he's just anybody who can say that their book is smut. I just thought he was just the warmest. I was like, man, this has got to be like the most warm, funny guy, ever. After leaving that, I was like, man, he is really as cool as people say he is. He's really great.
Space Fest is the place to meet all of these people because it is that relaxed atmosphere. I mean, it's happening in July. It's happening again, and it is the way you get to interact with people. And one of the great things is, this week I've seen a lot of people say, oh, I regret I saw him talking with his family and I didn't want to annoy him or upset him, and so I never went to say hi. And I feel like I should say, don't regret that. Never regret not bugging somebody when they're with their family and don't want to be disturbed. But he was an incredibly warm guy for when people did come up and say hi and he was in a public situation. And he was there because he was an artist, not because he was an astronaut. He was selling his watercolors because, unlike so many of these people, he knew when to retire. Most of these guys want to live forever. Most of these guys think they're still 20 and they're still chasing the same women they were when they were 20, but he was like, I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to go watercoloring. I'm going to enjoy life. And every now and then I'm going to get dragged to something in DC and have to say my thing, and that's fine. But most of the time I want to enjoy my retirement, enjoy my family. What a wonderful way to do that for the last sort of rounding out of life. But yes, such a nice guy. And so many good memories in that. I mean, when I was doing In the Shadow of the Moon, and I really wanted to get obscure stories about like Apollo 7's Don Isley, and I really wanted to get into all that. How did these EVA things happen? Who came up with the idea of underwater training? Who came up with the idea of this and that? And he was just not only was he full of knowledge, but he would give you a quote that was like instantly quip, funny, and informative all at once. Like the kind of thing it would take me all day to think of something that clever, and he would just come out with it. And it's pretty much verbatim in the books, just huge chunks of what he told me. I went through those interviews again recently before he died, and it was just like, wow, this is good stuff. And this is getting on for like 2 decades ago. Just great stuff. Very classy guy, very, very smart. Last time I saw him that I remember in any meaningful way, I was in New York in 2019 for the Explorers Club, which was another just lovely reunion of all these Apollo folks all got together in very relaxed atmosphere. And there was a lunch that I got invited to in a very fancy club downtown Manhattan. And Buzz was there, a bunch of other people were there. And we were sat at a table, and then there was a whole bunch of extra spaces, and all of a sudden Mike and his daughters came over and sat with us, and was like, oh, this is nice, this is different. Didn't think he'd remember who the hell I was, and the first thing he says is like, hey, Francis, you working on any books? I'm like, okay, this is nice. That's really the last thing I remember him saying to me of any significance. So that's like, okay, if you're going to have a nice last memory of somebody, that was it. Yeah, great guy.
I love that. That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. And of course, he was a wonderful family man, as we know. And one of the images of this last week, which has come out, which I thought was just the most wonderful, was there was a photo of him at the Cosmosphere was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, and there's about 20 kids in front of him, and he was teaching them how to make paper aeroplanes. And I just thought, you're one of the names that in 1,000 years people will still be reading about because you're on Apollo 11, and there you are, casually chilling out, teaching kids how to make paper airplanes. And I think that says so much about him.
I have, it's not really, well, it's not a personal story, but I do have a Mike Collins story. I think it was in 2018. I was at the National Aviation Hall of Fame induction. It's like a big, fancy, gala in Washington, D.C. And it was absolutely wonderful, but it was kind of intimidating. I hate saying that. They're going to hear this and be like, it was intimidating. But for me, it was intimidating just because everybody there is like a legend, like everyone, like people walk in and you're like, oh my God, that's so-and-so. That's so-and-so. Oh my God. Like I was like, if you have imposter syndrome, this is like, it's going to be like, your alarm will be like, whoop, 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 whoop.
They're all going, hey, it's Emily Carney. 20,000 people on Facebook obey her every whim. Be careful what you say around her. It works both ways, Emily. Yeah. Don't worry.
But I remember I was hanging out with Mark Usiak and I think with someone else. And we were just, chilling and chatting and stuff and, drinking our cocktails or whatever. And all of a sudden, like a hush descends over the crowd. I was like, who just walked in? Like, I'm thinking like royalty, like, a prince or princess. Somebody walked in. And then I look behind me and it's Mike Collins. And he had like a glass of wine. And he was talking to like, 4 or 5 people, and just being really casual. And some guy who I didn't even know comes up to me and he was like, hey, I don't know if this will pick it up. Hey, that's Mike Collins over there. Like, I'm like, yeah, from Apollo 11, he's really nice, and oh my God, and stuff like that. It was just, it kind of struck me. That's kind of the level of, I wouldn't say celebrity. That doesn't seem the right word, but that's kind of that's kind of the level of like importance this person had, and he was not being like a diva or any, I don't want to make it sound like, hey, Mike Collins was, he wasn't being a diva. He was just drinking a glass of wine, wearing a tuxedo, chilling, having a great time. But it was like automatically when he entered the room, it was like you could hear people like, oh my God, that's him, and it was just amazing. It was like, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that happen in my life at an event where somebody just walks in and everything just shuts down. Like, oh my God, that to me just said everything.
And that's probably a good place to end this conversation. But Francis, thank you so much for joining us and sharing a little bit about Mike, both his career and your personal stories. And we hope to have you on again sometime because there's so much we could talk to you about what you do and other things you've worked on and your areas of expertise. So I hope we get to talk to you another time if you'd be so willing to give us some more of your time.
Oh, I'd be happy to do so, particularly because I've yet to hear Emily's English accent, which is the only reason I really came here today. So, absolutely.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Yeah, we're probably going to get to that content with the fake British accent that everybody wants. So
it's going to happen this month.
It's going to happen very soon where we're going to get back to that fake British accent content that everybody's been asking about.
Yeah,
so,
I can't wait.
Yeah.
All right.
We have no intention of competing with the professionals, believe me.
So that was a really wonderful conversation with Francis. Thank you again for joining us. There was one thing that actually we spoke about with Francis once we pressed stop on our recording, which we didn't bring up. And I do feel like it's worth mentioning here. And that's the fact that Michael turned down the chance to be the backup commander for Apollo 14 when he got back from Apollo 11, which would have meant he would have commanded Apollo 17, which would have meant he would have walked on the moon. And he turned that down, knowing full well that although there were budget problems with NASA and no one knew what missions were going on, that Apollo 17 was pretty much certain to happen. But he gave that up because he wanted to spend more time with the family. The whole of Apollo 11 and the training for Gemini 10, he thought took him away from his family too much. And I think it just, again, goes to show the ego of the man that he didn't feel the need to have to go and do that. He'd been to the moon. He'd achieved what he wanted to achieve. And it was time for someone else to have a go.
Yeah, I feel like that's twofold, because there's the part where he's like, okay, I gotta, it's a lot of stress on my family, and, maybe I should walk, it's okay if I walk away from this opportunity, because my family's more important than just going to the moon. And then there's the kind of the other side of it, where he gave somebody else an opportunity who, Cernan wouldn't have done. We wouldn't know Cernan is the last man on the moon that had happened. So, so really, in the end, it's kind of a twofold thing there. And I won't mention any names, but there are guys who probably would have thrown somebody in front of a train to get an opportunity like that.
Yeah.
I mean, so for him to just say, I just want to, kind of retire from that and just spend, time with my family and just give someone else the opportunity. To me, that's like, that really shows you what kind of person he was by that, well, not by that point, just in general.
In general, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was just one other thing we wanted to bring up, because it's kind of a key part in the story. But thank you so much for joining us for this celebration of the life of Michael Collins.
We'll be back on Thursday on our usual schedule, but please do get in contact with us and tell us your stories and memories of Mike. He's someone we want to learn more about and continue to celebrate.
And thanks again to Francis for joining us. And thank you for listening. We'll see you on Thursday.
Space and Things has been brought to you by And Things Productions.